Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to this webinar about EU-funded fellowships and inclusion of researchers at risk. My name is Lena Kulmala, and I will be chairing today's webinar. I work as a Senior Internationalization Officer at Linnaeus University in Sweden, where I am the contact person for our membership in Scholars at Risk and part of the SAR Sweden section. This is a webinar within the Inspire Europe project, which is an EU-funded project under the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Actions and an initiative to support, promote, and integrate researchers at risk in Europe. In this webinar, we will address practices of inclusion for at-risk researchers in the EU fellowship programs and provide practical approaches to application selection and recruitment, as well as good practice on supporting researchers at risk receiving the fellowship position. With this webinar, we also hope to be providing guidance for future application structures and processes. So we have very interesting speakers with us today, representing the Commission, a researcher at risk who has received an Msca fellowship, and a project that offers fellowships for experienced researchers relocating to Ireland. I will present the speakers as we go along. So this is a Zoom webinar, which means that the cameras and microphones of the audience are closed. So what you can do, and what I really encourage you to do, is to post any questions you may have to the speakers in the Q&A, and we will raise these after the presentations and in a panel discussion. So moving on, I'm very happy to introduce Joel Hanisek, Policy and Program Manager for Scholars at Risk Europe, where he manages the Inspire project and supports the activities of SAR sections across Europe. Joel will give us a brief of the Inspire project and who researchers at risk are and why they are. So I welcome you to start, Joel, whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much, Lena, and thanks to you and to Linnaeus University for putting this webinar together, as well as to all of the speakers for sharing their time and expertise today. I suppose that I would like to start the presentation really by noting that when we speak about EU funding in the context of research and innovation, I think that it's important to recall the breadth of the programs that we're addressing. So today we're squarely focused on Horizon Europe and in particular MSCA. However, we also recognize that the impact of EU funding can be maximized through complementarities between programs. And I know that pursuing synergies between the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Actions and Erasmus Plus in the area of higher education, for instance, may be of particular interest to some viewers of the webinar today. While these aspects of complementarity and synergy exceed the scope of the presentation, they do demonstrate the range of funding options that are present within Europe. Our aim today, I suppose, is a bit more modest. On the one hand, we're inviting researchers at risk to consider funding options under Horizon Europe and other programs, and also to offer some practical tips in that regard. And on the other, we're interested in analyzing the nature and the structure of the programs themselves, including asking how they might better acknowledge the particular situation of at-risk applicants. This webinar is, of course, convened under the auspices of Inspire Europe, which is an MSCA-funded project itself that has the goal of growing a stronger support network across Europe for researchers at risk. And by researchers at risk, we mean researchers, scholars, and scientists at all stages of their research careers who are experiencing threats to their life, liberty, or research, as well as those who have been displaced because of such threats. While some of these researchers may hold asylum or similar protection status, a more significant proportion are outside of the refugee process and therefore seek or hold temporary visas or work permits through visiting positions at host universities that are outside of their home countries. This means that while researchers at risk are laboring amidst the same research infrastructure and funding calls as their fellow researchers, they're oftentimes doing so with distinct disadvantages related to their category of risk or exile. Organizations specializing in the field of scholar protection, as well as some national and regional programs, mitigate this to some degree with risk-specific fellowships such as the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation's Philip Schwartz Initiative. Other similar fellowships can be found on the SAR Europe Fellowships and Direct Support page, and I'll share a link to that within the chat function. Through Inspire Europe, we've continued to encourage the growth of such national level actions for scholar protection. And similarly, we're also aware and grateful that wider discussions about a country agnostic European fellowship scheme are live and ongoing. And of course, we're very excited about the advent of the new MSCA for Ukraine grants under Horizon Europe, which will enable researchers from Ukraine to continue their research and also to facilitate reintegration when safe conditions for return are met. All of these initiatives help tremendously to expand opportunities for researchers at risk, which is also the title of a recent Inspire Europe policy recommendation report, which you see here. In the context of this webinar, I want to note that of our 8 recommendations in this summary policy report, we dedicate one entirely to facilitating access of researchers at risk to existing European funding programs. This recommendation acknowledges that many excellent researchers who are currently at risk may find these programs difficult to access due to eligibility criteria, application procedures, and evaluation criteria. It also recognizes the importance of improving the visibility of European programs such as MSCA amongst researchers at risk, as we are trying to do today. The Inspire Europe project would recommend that access by researchers at risk to existing EU fellowship programs, particularly the MSCA, therefore be widened, including through the following measures. On a policy level, there are 4 points that we make. The first is that communication should be enhanced about European and national programs and their opportunities for researchers at risk. So for instance, researchers at risk should be explicitly mentioned and encouraged to apply in calls for applications. And European programs should make use of national and international networks supporting researchers at risk, including Inspire Europe, to ensure wide dissemination of their calls. The number 2 point is that eligibility criteria should be adjusted. For example, the more flexible mobility rule that MSCA currently applies to applicants in the refugee process should be extended to those in an at-risk situation. Number 3 is that application procedures should be made more flexible. For example, by a second intake of applications that could reduce waiting periods for researchers at risk, or by waiving the joint nature of applications so that researchers could apply as individuals first and approach potential host institutions if their MSCA application were to be successful. In this regard, a dedicated category should also be created in application forms, allowing applicants to identify as a researcher at risk. Fourthly, evaluation criteria should be adjusted. More openness in the evaluation process to non-linear career tracks would enhance the application prospects of researchers at risk. Evaluators and selection committees should be trained on the situation of researchers at risk, and if possible, funding should be earmarked for a number of researchers at risk. And finally, at the institutional level, HEIs should implement the MSCA guidelines for inclusion of researchers at risk, which I imagine others on the panel may also wish to speak to. And so I'll stop here with respect to time, but I hope that these recommendations do provide some points for thought and engagement later in our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joel. There are many good recommendations mentioned, and Inspire have assisted the European Commission with developing the MSCA guidelines for the inclusion of researchers at risk, and with the recommendations on how to improve the recruitment. So that's very good. And on that note, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Marlene Bartes, Policy Officer at the MSCA Unit, Directorate General for Education, Cultural, Youth and Sport at the European Commission. Marlene, you joined the EC in 2013, and since 2020, you're part of the team in charge of the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Actions, which is the EU's reference program for doctoral education and postdoctoral training, where you follow the topic of researchers at risk. So we look forward now to hear you give us an insight into the new guidelines, and also, if possible, with a practical approach on application, selection and recruitment. And it would be interesting to to hear how the guidelines can contribute to more applications and fellowships. So please go ahead, Marlene.
Thank you, Lena, and thank you, Joelle. Yes, so I work at the European Commission, and I'll try to briefly introduce you to the opportunities available for researchers at risk, and maybe some advice on how to further include researchers at risk in our program. So I'll focus only on the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions. However, as Joelle mentioned, there are other funding, EU funding programs available to researchers at risk, such as Erasmus+, for instance, or the European Research Council, ERC, grants for postdoctoral researchers. So even though we're not covering these today, I would also encourage you to have a look at those simply by Googling them, for example. But focusing on the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, or MSCA in short, as was mentioned, this is the EU's flagship program for the training and mobility of researchers at any stage of their career. So we do fund early stage researchers, but we also fund more experienced researchers and postdocs. We are part of Horizon Europe, so the EU's framework program for research and innovation, which has a total budget of 95 billion euros. And within that, we, the MSCA, we have a budget of 6.6 billion euros for 7 years. So this is not for 1 year only, it's until 2027. We cover the whole world, and we're open to any nationality, meaning that we do include researchers at risk wherever they are from. And actually, if you look at the work program of the MSCA on page 8, so this is basically our legal basis, their MSCA projects are encouraged to facilitate access by researchers at risk. What is important to know is that the MSCA is a bottom-up program. So what does it mean? It means that it is the researcher or the organizations that apply for funding that decide on which topic they want to cooperate on, or which discipline. So it is not us at the European Commission who impose any scientific discipline. It is a very international program, meaning that we cover European countries, but also non-EU third countries. It is intersectoral. So what we mean by intersectoral is that it covers the academic and non-academic sectors, which I think is important as we have a very strong involvement of industry or SMEs, for instance, which is good for career development opportunities outside of academia. For instance, and the MSCA are not only for individual researchers, they're also for, or mainly actually for, organizations who then recruit researchers. So we do also have a strong structuring impact on these organizations, helping them, for instance, develop their internationalization strategies. It was mentioned before, together with Inspire Europe, we have developed so-called guidelines on the inclusion of researchers at risk. It is a quite short document, so I would really invite you to have a look. You have the link here on this slide. The slides will also be shared later on. We can put it in the chat. So this short document really explains who are researchers at risk, as Joelle just said, why it is important to support them, and then more importantly, how can you support them, and also giving some very concrete best practice examples, as well as a lot of links to more information and resources. So really, I would encourage you to read them. I've here, sorry for the text heavy slide, but I've tried to summarize a little bit what kind of practices we recommend. So they are recommended practices. It's important to say that they're recommended, not mandatory, meaning that these should be implemented on a best effort basis. They are not part of the contractual obligation of MSCA projects, but this also means that they are not only addressed to MSCA beneficiaries. Actually, these practices can be implemented by any institution interested in hosting or recruiting researcher at risk. So you do not have to be an MSCA beneficiary, which I think is important. And more specifically, we look at three things. So dissemination, more application and recruitment, and then pre-arrival and post-arrival measures. So for instance, under dissemination, one recommendation would be to communicate any open calls for recruitment you might have, for instance, to Inspire Europe, so the consortium, or Scholars at Risk Europe, so that they can help you disseminate these amongst their stakeholders. You could mention specifically researchers at risk in recruitment calls, so on your website or social media, for instance, giving the definition of researchers at risk so that they can identify themselves better. In terms of application, selection, and recruitment, again, I think a dedicated section on your webpage or even a whole dedicated webpage with information for researchers at risk could be very useful. You could also provide tailored advice and guidance. So for instance, by setting up a dedicated contact point, and actually one of the speakers today is doing just that and will be able to tell you more. You should always try to, if you can, take into consideration the specific situation of researchers at risk during the selection process when you have open calls. So for example, you could hire independent experts in your selection committee, or brief the selection committee ahead of the evaluation procedure. And obviously you should always be very sensitive to security concerns. So try to protect as much as possible the researcher's confidentiality. And then in terms of pre-arrival and post-arrival measures, in the guidelines, you will see there's a long list of available resources and experienced support organizations, such as, for instance, Scholars at Risk, but also others. You could think about designating an academic and administrative mentor at your organization and provide training for them so that they are able to help, for example, with visa issues, travel arrangements, housing, etc. And then you should try and offer career development and training opportunities to researchers, such as, for example, language courses or transferable skills. So this, in a nutshell, are some of the practices we recommend to our MSCA beneficiaries. But as I said, they can also be implemented by any institution interested in hosting researchers at risk. Now, looking more specifically at the different actions, I mean, for those of you who are maybe not too familiar with the MSCA, so I will briefly mention the four main actions that we have. To be noted that Doctoral Networks, staff exchanges, and Cofund are more for organizations wanting to recruit researchers or postdoctoral researchers, and then Postdoctoral Fellowships is for individuals. So Doctoral Networks, as the name says, is a consortium of organizations, academic or non-academic, in Europe and beyond, who want to recruit researchers. So they are responsible for setting the criteria, the selection criteria of their researchers. Postdoctoral fellowships here are for one individual postdoctoral researcher who already has a PhD, who will apply together with a host organization in Europe to receive funding to carry out his or her research. So for 1 year up to 2 years, it can be in Europe or also outside Europe for a specific amount of time. Staff exchanges, as the name says, is for the exchange of staff or the mobility of staff. So here again, it's a consortium of organizations, academic or non-academic, who apply together, and then they send their recruited staff. So the staff is already employed in their institution, which I think is important to say. And then this person can go to one of the partners in the consortium for up to 1 year to carry out research and innovation activities in the framework of the project. And then finally, we have Cofund, which here again is one organization that applies for funding. And then this organization sets up doctoral or postdoctoral training programs and recruits researchers and offers quite generous fellowships. If we look at a little bit the rules, and I think these are very important to know. So we have, and Joelle mentioned it before, a so-called mobility rule for postdoctoral fellowships, doctoral networks, and Cofund projects. So as I said before, recruited researchers can be of any nationality. There's no restriction here. However, they should not have resided or carried out their main activity in the country of the recruiting beneficiary for more than 1 year in the 3 years just before the recruitment date. So this is important to note. However, if you have spent some time to obtain a refugee status, then this time spent in the country will be deducted from this 12-month rule. Looking at funding, just to give you an idea, so for doctoral networks and postdoctoral fellowships, this is a little bit how our funding is constructed. So we always have a so-called researcher unit cost and the institutional unit cost. So for the researcher, it's the money that goes to the individual per month. And then per individual, there's also an amount of money that goes to the organization that recruits him or her. So if we look at the living allowance, for instance, these are gross amounts, so they should cover, a compulsory deduction under national law, such as social security, taxes, etc. The mobility allowance is only for private related mobility costs. So if you have to travel for professional reasons, then this will be covered by the institution under the research, training, and networking costs. If you have costs that contribute directly to the development of the researcher, for example, language courses, these are eligible also, again, under the research, training, and networking costs. And then on top of these, we also have so-called long-term leave and special needs allowances, so if applicable. So if you, for example, if you have a paternity or maternity leave, then there's also additional funding available for this. This is the calendar, the call calendar for this year, so 2022. So if you're interested in applying, the postdoctoral fellowships and doctoral networks calls are open now. So all the calls are published on the so-called funding and tender opportunities portal. So if you're interested, you should go there and have a look and apply by the deadline that you can see here. So 2 still this year, September and November, and then for staff exchanges and Cofund, it is only early next year. So if you are an organization, go to the funding and tenders portal. All the documents are available there, very useful ones, such as a guide for applicants, the MSCA work program, templates, FAQs, etc. I would also encourage you to have a look at the portal and our social media to see if there are webinars organized either by us at the European Commission or the Research Executive Agency, REA, as well as the Euraccess network or our alumni association. So we do offer webinars, very concrete, on applications with tips and tricks, etc. So don't hesitate to attend these webinars. We also have what we call MSCA National Contact Points, so MSCA NCPs, in not only in Europe, but also in countries outside Europe, and they are really there to help you reply to your questions, help you put together a successful application, etc. So also don't hesitate to reach out to them. And if you're looking for partners, there's actually a partner search tool on the portal as well. So don't hesitate to have a look there, and you have the link at the bottom of the screen. So if you go there, just type MSCA and you will have all the calls currently available. If you are an individual, so as I said, researchers at risk are eligible for all our MSCA actions. So if you want to apply for a PhD position under, for example, Doctoral Networks, then you do not apply to us at the European Commission. You go on EURAccess. I will show you on the next slide what it looks like. But so you go to the EURAccess job portal, which you can then search according to the country you're interested in, the discipline, etc. And there you apply directly to the program. So you don't apply to us, you apply to the PhD program you're interested in, according to the deadline set by the program. If you want to apply, so you have a PhD and you want to do a postdoc, then you have to find a host organization in Europe. So either you already have contacts in your network, or you can reach out also to, as I said, the MSCA national contact points, for instance, and then you apply together with that host organization through the funding and tenders portal. And the deadline here is set by us. And so it's 14 September 2022. And then this will be assessed by our research executive agency. And then for Cofund, here it's similar to the doctoral network. So you have both PhD and postdocs positions. You can apply directly to the program on EURAccess, for instance. And then staff exchanges, as I mentioned, you have to already be employed by the organization in the project. So you have to talk to your organization to find out if there is funding available. This is just a screenshot of EURAccess, so the job portal, which has many job opportunities in Europe and beyond, funded by the MSCA, but not only. So there's also, I mean, for example, the European Research Council grants are there, but also positions offered by member states. So if you're looking for a vacancy, please have a look at EURAccess. And specifically for refugees, there is under EURAccess the so-called Science for Refugees initiative, which offers or lists refugee-friendly internships or part-time and full-time jobs. It also gives you access to the European research community. For instance, there's a very interesting initiative that is called Find a Research Buddy. So if you want to have a matching tool according to your sector of interest or your research with a European equivalent. And there's also a lot of information on and support services on working and living in Europe. So for instance, also those produced by the Inspire Europe project are easily accessible there. And then finally, under EURAccess, we also have the so-called ERA for Ukraine initiative. So the European Research Area for Ukraine, which is a one-stop shop listing all the initiatives available to support researchers who had to flee Ukraine. So not only EU initiatives or EU support, but also support from different member states and Horizon Europe associated countries. So I would invite you to also have a look there if you are a displaced researcher from Ukraine and looking for support. And Joel very briefly mentioned it in his speech. The European Commission will launch the so-called MSCA for Ukraine program, which is a fellowship program of 25 million euros to support researchers who had to flee Ukraine. And we hope that the activities will start just after the summer. So keep your eyes and ears open. We will do, of course, some promotion and communication once the project is up and running. And this is just the key resources that I would encourage you to have a look at. So I've mentioned most of them. We do have a website, the funding and tenders portals for the calls, EURAccess for vacancies and jobs, the MSCA national contact points in case you have any questions on the application, or if you want to find partners, the Alumni Association, and then the guidelines on the inclusion of researchers at risk. And we also do have guidelines on supervision more specifically. And with this, I hand over to you, Lena.
Thank you so much, Marlene. There are so many tips, and I'm very happy that we will that you will share the PowerPoint with us with all those links in it. So we will now hear from a researcher at risk who is on an MSCA fellowship. Rifat Ali Yalcin is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Université de Poitiers in France under the MSCA fellowship. Rifat Yalcin holds a PhD degree in mechanical engineering from Boğaziçi University in Turkey. He came to France in 2019 thanks to the French Post program. In Université de Poitiers, he found an opportunity to finish his former studies and conduct new ones. First, he won the Fulbright Fellowship and went to UCLA in the beginning of 2021 for about a year. And then he won the Msca Individual Fellowship and returned to France and Université de Poitiers at the end of last year. So Rifat, I'm keen to find out more about how you gained this fellowship and the support you received whilst applying, and if you have any guidance to future hosts and applicants, and also if you experienced any barriers in applying as a researcher at risk. So welcome, Rifat, the floor is yours.
Thank you for introducing me. Yes, I'm happy to be here, and I'm glad to share my experience. I'm Rifat, and today I will present you how my Msca Individual Fellowship came about. I will start with a brief self-introduction. As Lena already mentioned, I'm a mechanical engineer. All my degrees are from Turkey. And I started a short postdoc at Sabancı University, but I signed a petition against Turkish Republic, the crimes against Kurdish people, when I was a PhD student, and then the prosecutor asked for 7.5-year imprisonment of me. After the first trial, I came to France, thanks to the PAUS Fellowship, and I stayed at France about 2 years under the Academic at Risk Fund. Then I was lucky enough to get to a prestigious fellowship. First, I went to UCLA, mechanical engineering again for a year. Then on October, I returned to France and I started my Msca Individual Fellowship. I mainly work on radiative heat transfer and photonics, and my applications are like solar energy. And for my Mercury Fellowship, I'm working on increasing crop production with fluorescent coatings, but I will not get too deep detail about this. As you can see, my family, we are happy to be here also. But still, I want to mention about some problems I experienced abroad as a scholar at risk. First, the political one. After I came here, an arrest warrant came after me. So it just I disabled me to access to Turkish embassy to get my papers, to change my, for example, driving license or register our child to family documents. Then, of course, the language barrier. When I came to France, I couldn't speak French. Now, although I can speak a bit, it's not enough for me to teach in French. So the permanent positions are hard to access for me. And the highest burden to me is like my kid's adaptation problem to the maternal school. Actually, now he gets used to his friends and he started to speak French and understand it, but it affects my mobility. I don't want him to face same if I move to another country. So I'm restricted for my search in France. Also about like social problems, like my access to my hobbies, friends and family is limited dramatically. I was like addicted to my aquarium hobby. I had more than 40 aquariums in my hobby room. I was also president of an aquarium association in Turkey. I just left all them behind. So okay, I have much more time to study. And also, I think it was an important word to mention that I accepted the fact that I ran away, and like it's easy to challenge and lying behind the bars. So I just gave up like dealing with the problems in Turkey. Of course, I'm continuing to have people, academics at risk, but I just concentrate more on my studies. And also, it's not limited with academic at risk, but there's an immigrant psychology that when you are an immigrant, you need to feel that you should work more. it's I think like helped me to adapt better, also like to have to feel like you are accepted here. So it also like realizing and accepting those facts helped me a lot. The biggest problem is like about me is the future. When I think about it, like I feel like punch in my stomach, like will I ever find a permanent position? I still have 1.5 years my current contract, but still it seems like a quite big obstacle for me, considering all the family issues. But also I need to mention that like it's not specific to academics at risk. If you're an academic abroad, like, except the political case, most of them is also applicable for you. Even if you are an academic in your own country, I think the future category is also common. So maybe we should work together, not only with the academics at risk, but other academics to find solution to these problems. And first thing is first, when I was writing my proposal, is how I mentioned my risk situation. There was a separate funding section. I mentioned that it was the only funding that I had get so far when I applied for the Marie Curie. And I mentioned about the PAUSE program in the funding section. Then in the integration section, the reviewer expect you to describe how you will integrate to the host country and the laboratory. Here I mentioned that I'm already working at that laboratory, and I came there with the PAUSE program that helps researchers that are persecuted in their country. Sorry. But what would I prefer? Actually, there are two major categories in MSCA, with like European Fellowship and Global Fellowship. It would be good to have a separate section for academics at risk. I will mention it my next slide. There's a weighting in the project when the reviewers are grading your project. And there could be additional section about like academics in risk, but I find it a bit like, I think it's not just, because I don't want to pass another researcher using my handicap. So I will prefer it at the way that with a separate section, and there could be a weighting of the risk situation in that case, if there's a separate one, so that the evaluators can judge the how severe the risk situation is. And the guide that I follow, I'll also put that link into the chat. I mean, to me, it was the Bible. While following the, while writing my project, I followed it very strictly because I understand that it's so valuable and to the point. As I will show it in the next slide, it just provides a lot of beneficial points, and I addressed each of them, of course, to the one that are applicable for my case. And also I considered weight of each section, because we have a 10-page limit and we need to use it wisely, because like even if there isn't a page limit, there is the limit of the attention that the reviewer will pay to your project. So distributing them with respect to the section weight as for me the way I follow. Here are the example guidelines. In the template, the guideline say us that we need to use a proposal template with the exact subheadings, and it gives the tip that the evaluators has some template and they are grading us and they are following. And when we follow this structure, we are helping them to understand what we are doing. And also there are a lot of other beneficial bullet points, for example, avoiding jargon, because they might not be the expert in our research area. So especially while we are describing what we did, the background work, we need to, what I did was I used just briefly and clearly what I did. And also it's important to address the society, like which kind of problem our project is aiming to solve. There are like UN Sustainable Development Goals. For my case, it was like 1 and 2, like improving the crop in a greenhouse. For your case, of course, it could be different, but it's important to convince the reviewers that they are really helping. And also how this fund will shape your career. It's good to answer for academics at risk, like how can we switch to normal funds and or industry. Like first, I think like I try to answer, convince myself and then the reviewers. In my case, I thought like I said that I will use, I will learn near field radiative transfer and I will use a software to solve it. It will benefit me if I work in industry. It's used in industry. I gave examples, and also in the academy, I give examples. So you can follow a similar approach. And at the end of the day, you get results. You get the results and feedback around February. And my motivation was like, even if I don't get the fellowship, I thought that I will like come up with a well-defined proposal so I can consider them for other applications. But I was lucky enough, and my proposal was accepted. But if I wasn't, after I addressed the weaknesses, I would submit it elsewhere. And like here you can see, like for my case, it's a bit advertisement, sorry for that, but my score was high. You generally need to achieve like 93 depending on the year. And you can see that your the reviewers mention about the strengths as well as your weakness for each different sections. Also, this is from my friend's application, a negative feedback. If it's negative, generally the weaknesses are, as you can see, longer, and you need to address them more in detail for your future applications. And how to find a good project. Of course, networking is very important. For my case, I wrote to the authors of impactful articles. The articles that I knew and benefited from, so that the topic was in my field, and I was lucky enough to get response from the first trial. So I also suggest you the same approach. And also here I will repeat myself, the project should address society to get much more points. Also, interdisciplinary projects gain much more attraction. And the farther the topics, the better the results. For example, if it is like sociology and psychology, probably should be less interdisciplinary. It's not my field. I shouldn't talk maybe too much in detail, but they should be apart from each other. And it was not applicable for me, but also the gender studies. When you work on gender studies, or like there are some categories like that, you get additional points. You should consider those. And lastly, how did I find my project? It was an extension of my PhD study. It could be the case for you. There are certain advantages of that. First, like you probably have some publications on that topic, so you can convince the reviewers that you are capable to do that, perform that research. And also, if they are recent, it also proved that like other peer reviewers accepted that, and the journals accepted that this research topic is recent. But of course, there's a disadvantages. It shouldn't look like an extension of a project of the former one, but a complete new project. So I needed to convince the reviewers about novelty and impact. First, I clearly and briefly described what I did. So you need to show that you have wideness and you have depth. But you can't do both at the same time for each topic because the page limit and the attention limit. So for the old stuff, the background, I just show how wide what I did. And if they are interested, I just provide them the previous works, the references. But I emphasize the novelty of the new approach and get into detail only for that section. And even though I think they found it not enough, because as a minor weakness, they said that it was incompletely described. And also, I think it's lastly important to mention that it's important to emphasize what you will contribute to the host and what will host contributes to the you. This is what they are mostly also searching for. And I want to thank to France, PAUSE, and my institute to make all this possible. I'm really grateful for them. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rifat. Thank you to you for sharing your experience so openly and how it can be to be an academic abroad, and for your feedback and recommendation for more inclusion of applications and researchers at risk, as well as these tips to the applicants and hosts. So it was mentioned before that MSCA provide contact points, and we will now hear from Moira Brophy, and she holds a PhD in political theory from University College of Dublin and has over 7 years experience working in research development and management. She was a former contact point for researchers at risk in the EDGE program, which is an MSCA Cofund action. And currently she is the Dean of Graduate Studies and Research at the Technological University of the Shannon in Ireland. So a warm welcome to you, Moira.
Thank you. Give me 1 second and let me share my presentation. So I hope you can see that now. Yeah, so I'm going to echo a lot of what has already been said. I'm going to just talk about a specific case study. This was a Marie Curie co-fund, and I'm delighted that Marlene has introduced you to what Marie Curie co-funds are. And this was under the call in 2015. I'm just going to close my window. 2015 call, and the project was funded in 2016, which honestly feels like 100 years ago now. I'm glad to see some of the talk has moved on. To give you a bit of detail on the project, this was an extremely large project. We used, there was a Science Foundation Ireland centres programme, and 3 of the centres got together, one of the largest research funding in Ireland, and 3 of the centres got together. And these centres are based in ICT and materials, and tried to leverage our funding against Marie Curie co-fund application. So we come with this extremely large project that totals over 13 million euro, with a 6 million euro input from the co-fund program, and the rest of the money came from SFI and industry partners, as we sort of molded each fellowship differently depending on what they needed. There was a real drive for career development in the program as we put it together. We weren't thinking about researchers at risk at the time. I'll get onto that in a minute. We were heavily thinking about our lack of sort of EDI and equality, bearing in mind we were coming from ICT and there were very few women. There was lots of leaky pipeline stuff. So we looked at really creating a program that really was the career catalyst, like that you came into it and you were in for 2 years, but like maybe you would leave before the end of 2 years to a much better job, you know? So we really wanted to give the fellows everything so that they would really kind of springboard on to the next thing. And it was a really successful program from that respect. We had a brilliant training program, and bearing in mind, again, we like mostly computer scientists and material scientists. We had a great staff who put together a brilliant training program, including things like creative arts practice, which we found was really beneficial. The fellows reported as being really beneficial to them, that sort of giving them the space to think differently and move differently. So the program was a 5-year program from 2016. I think there was probably a bit of no cost extensions, but it's certainly finished up by now. The ask we got then in 2016 after we were funded, and to just take you back to the time period, I would say while there was many researchers at risk across Europe already, the conflict in Syria was probably high up on the agenda at that point. And we got a request from the EU to include measures to support researchers at risk in a program. And Elena mentioned that I have a PhD in political theory. My research area, my own home, long time ago research area, was looking at humanitarian intervention. So I suppose I have a little bit of knowledge in the area, even though at the time I was working primarily with computer scientists. So what we did was we looked to engage with people who knew more about this than we did. So the Irish Refugee Council were really, really supportive at the time, really helpful, talking about like the kinds of people that might be it might be useful for. And we connected with the SARA network, the Scholar Rescue Fund network as well. And we tried to figure out what barriers there might be and what ways we could remove them. So you don't need to read the tiny smaller writing. That's just an example. What we did was we tried to gather all the practical information in one place. So this is where we created on our website a researchers at risk page. So we wanted to say, like, look, if you have a question about your qualifications, this is the Irish national body for that. If you are concerned about having difficulty accessing the website, we made sure our website was accessible from a phone. It's really important to us that you could apply for our program on a phone if you needed to. We set up a contact point. This was me, and just it was in no way, I don't know what percentage of my job it ended up being, but I had a very busy other job. But I think it just meant that I ended up being the first port of call for a lot of things. And we tried to look at like what kinds of things people might experience, like they might come to Ireland with no ready money. You know, when you're paid in Ireland, you're paid a month in arrears, you're paid at the end of the month after you do the work. So we looked at ways that within our own accounting practices, we could support people who might come with nothing. So we tried to think as many practical things as we could. We also, in parallel, were obviously looking at like people who might want to come to Ireland who are not researchers at risk, but might have family with them. So we were looking at kind of marrying these things with our structures to support families as well. We pushed it out through the existing networks and we looked at these practical ways. One of the things we did that was a bit different was we said if we got anyone who was interested in applying and could come, we would pay for them to come to Dublin or wherever in the country for 2 weeks to work with their supervisor, potential supervisor on an application, so that they would have like a much better chance of developing, and they might get something out of it, even if they weren't successful. This is where it comes back to some of the things that were raised already. The fellowships are highly competitive. They were designed to be highly competitive. We had to report on the numbers funded versus the number of applicants. And researchers at risk may have specific difficulties in this track record. So while Refat was very right when he talked about the weighting and the things that you looked at, you were kind of viewed, and we based our application materials very much on the IF, the individual fellowship mercury. So we like when people can, and we can ourselves, reuse the work we've done. So we created this program whereby people could use the same proposal to apply for individual fellowship if they didn't get it on the first round. But really reviewers are looking at the proposal idea and the track record of the person as well. And obviously researchers at risk might have difficulties in track record, especially in a highly competitive environment. Obviously lives are disrupted. Just to give you a specific example for ICT, in ICT, it moves so fast that they don't even rely on journal publications. It is conferences that is their main kind of dissemination output. And if you can't travel, then it's very hard to create a track record of peer-reviewed stuff in ICT. So that was one of our particular things for the fields we were in. The type and direction of the research might have been subject to control as another thing. Again, ICT, engineering. In Ireland, maybe a little bit different to a lot of European countries, we're a neutral country, so none of our research can have military applications. So when we have researchers at risk whose track record or their area that they might have worked in would have been maybe solely military applications, that becomes really difficult for them to change that and parse that into what's normal in Ireland. And of course, there's lots of other issues related to academic freedom and the exploration of ideas. We did ask the Commission at the time if we could ask for a different set of criteria to review the researchers at risk applications, because it became very evident to us that in this highly competitive environment, the applicants that we were seeing would likely not succeed or not meet that. And we were told that we could educate the reviewers about researchers at risk, but we could not change the criteria. So I would really, really support Joel's comment and Rafet's comment, everyone's comment, that there should be a separate funding stream for researchers at risk, not because they are not excellent researchers, but because it is very difficult for them to display that in a way that other researchers who have not gone through the same thing can. And it's not a reflection, it doesn't show a true reflection of their potential, of their ideas and their exploration. You don't need to read this tiny, tiny writing here. That's just an example of an email that I got. So what happened for me was, I think if you Googled researchers at risk, our page on the EDGE website is the top hit. I just searched it down, I think we're hit number 4. But at the time, I got queries from researchers at risk in every discipline. So ones that were absolutely not eligible for our program. And what I did over time was amass this large email with as many links as I could to say, these are various programs that I know about that are wider disciplines would include this. Or if you're interested in coming to Ireland and looking for a standard job, you can, like, here's where our jobs are advertised. Here's the various funding streams in Ireland. So really, I suppose what I want to show you there is the amount of links that are on that email. And one of the things then, if someone had difficulty getting contact with a supervisor or missing a deadline or something like that, they could ask me. And we had more or less agreed that I kind of free rein to say, look, that's a reasonable extension, or if you want me to review your proposal, I'll review it beforehand. So we would kind of provide extra supports there in any way that we could. And again, we found it really useful to connect with the networks that were there who could push that out. But because we were in a very specific area, we didn't necessarily have a lot of kind of lining up in the right way. We had one pre-applicant come who was based in another European country, but was from Syria, come and spend 2 weeks in Ireland with us. And I think it was a good experience for him, but the outcome wasn't good in terms of the fellowship program for all the reasons that we had mentioned. So I suppose really, the real outcome when I talk about this experience is we didn't recruit any researchers at risk to EDGE, which is why I'm really glad to see that this sort of parameters are changing, because I think that's really, really important. We found that, like, it's very hard to get a Marie Curie fellowship in any circumstances. They are ultra competitive. Rafet there talked about the 93, 94%. He's dead right. In order to get an individual fellowship, that's how good you have to be. And adding the compounding factor of being a researcher at risk can just make that prohibitively difficult. It can also, from the point of view of where in Ireland, it can be really difficult for a researcher at risk to break into the network and drive an application and understand the sort of, like, yeah, you have to chase the person who might be supervising you a bit, they might be super busy, or, you know, there's a degree to which you have to drive it, and maybe you don't understand. Like, our Irish culture is incredibly indirect. We just don't tend to say what we mean, which is very difficult. It's very difficult if you are coming and you're just communicating by email. So a lot of what I would have done would be to try and chase people to make sure that they were coming back to potential applicants. And the nature of academia is they were also free to ignore me when I chased them, even if I went and found them in person. So that can be quite difficult to do. I think a lot of individual fellowship applications, for example, would be connections made at conferences. And so there would already be that connection in place. We did a lot of matching in the EDGE program. It really tried to connect people, but then sometimes certain potential supervisors would be incredibly popular and they simply wouldn't have the scope to support 5 or 6 applications. So it was quite challenging. I'm going to say we did learn some things out of it. And I think we are way more aware, and everyone across the 3 research centres and everyone that's gone through that is a bit more aware of the challenges for researchers at risk across our networks. As new programs came up, we folded in the support. So we folded in anything that was there, tried to do webinars, more information on how to apply and how to be successful. We used the networks, those researchers at risk networks, for those new programs as well. As I said, we had one applicant come to Dublin. And for me personally, I really wanted to be involved in the Inspire Europe project because I really wanted to make sure that we didn't make the same mistake again, create another fellowship program that precluded people almost accidentally because it didn't consider those. So for me, it's motivated me to be involved a lot, and I've been involved with the Scholar Rescue Fund as well, sometimes just trying to connect people or trying to explain the European system, and a lot of what's happened here today and that great advice that you've been getting, particularly from Refit, about how to apply and what they look for. That's really, really important, and it's very hard to understand outside the system. And it's tough to understand when you're inside the system as well, and you're connected with people who have a lot of experience. We'd still have a massive failure rate in a lot of applying to those things. So I think it's great to see the work of the Inspire Europe project and how it's moved towards addressing it. But I would wholeheartedly support a specific program of fellowships for researchers at risk, or a stream within fellowship programs for researchers at risk. I think that's really important. So that's me done. Thanks.
Thank you so much. There were a lot of good recommendations there, and that also followed, from what Refat shared. And we've had so many questions in the chat, but they have actually been answered along the way, most of them. So I'm not sure that we need, the time is out as well. So I was just trying to see if there's something that we need to raise here, but yeah, it's been questions about the age. Thank you for being there. And it's a question here: does the Commission plan to change the mobility rules and academic age too? Is there anything that could you answer that, Marlene?
Yes. So yeah, for the mobility rule, well, thank you to the Inspire Europe project actually for looking and making recommendations on that. We understand that it is problematic, and we're currently analyzing ways to maybe soften it to also include researchers at risk more generally, and not only those with refugee status. But it is more complicated than it seems, unfortunately, because of the quite vague definition of researchers at risk, but also, and I think more importantly, because as I said, it is the programs that recruit the researchers, that are responsible for recruiting the researchers, but then the eligibility of the costs will have to be checked later on by us at the European Commission, and it could then happen that there is a discrepancy in the interpretation of at risk, and that then the costs become ineligible. So there are quite a few layers of complexity, but we are looking at them and also discussing it with our research executive agency to see if there's something that could be done for those obvious cases, like, for example, I mean, Afghanistan or now Ukraine, where I think it is easier to have a clear definition. And I think one of the questions earlier on was also on, how do you define research at risk? Is domestic abuse, for instance, would that count also as at risk? So it is actually quite complicated. But yes, and then on the age, I mean, there's no age limit. There is indeed a limit in the numbers of years of research experience. This was introduced because we do want also to favor maybe more, not young, but less experienced researchers. But then there is, for example, the European Research Council, who also offers scholarships or fellowships to more experienced researchers. And yes, all of this is, and I think, Mary, you mentioned it well, the MSCA are highly competitive, not only for researchers at risk, but for any researcher worldwide, I mean, regardless of the publications or track record. So the success rate is actually quite low across the board, which shouldn't discourage researchers at risk, who are excellent as well. And we've seen it and we've heard it today. So I hope that was inspiring. And we at the European Commission are definitely looking into ways to further support research at risk, and not necessarily only through the MSCA, but maybe also outside. So this is currently a reflection that is ongoing, and that the Inspire Europe project has contributed a lot to. So we will have to see in the coming months or years what will come of this.
Thank you so much, Marlene. I think that was a very good conclusion of this webinar. Unless, is there anyone else here who wish to say something before we close? No, so thank you so much, and a big thank you also for Joel for his support, and also I would like to acknowledge Gibran Al-Sayed. He's a new program associate at SAR Europe and has been assisting with this webinar. So I think on that note, we will close today's webinar. Thank you so much for all the contributions, and it has been recorded. So we will send an email to all that have registered, and with evaluation, and also where we post this recording, and there you'll also have all these useful links, and hopefully also we can share the PowerPoints. Thank you so much. Goodbye.